Who are you? And who do you think you are? Who do you think you are? That's right.
We made history this week. We all made history. For the first time in a very, very long time, we stood up and we empowered ourselves. First time in a very, very long time, we stood up and we empowered ourselves. When we said to that corporation that runs that hospital, we said, no, you are not going to continue to step all over us and our patients. We said, no, we are going to be able to take care of our patients. That corporation has been treating patients like numbers for far too long. We're at a point where we're going to tell them, no, we are not going to allow you to treat those patients like numbers. They are human beings. Treat them like they are. So here we are out today to come and show that hospital that's what we're all about. If we stay together, we cannot be defeated.
I am so proud of every single one of both of our membership. We are here. We put quality in the care that we give. We are not just faces. We are the people that have the hearts. We're the people faces. We are the people that have the hearts. We're the people that hold your hands when you're sick. When your family is sick, we're there to comfort you and make sure you're okay.
For all the houses here and all the surrounding southeastern Connecticut area,
this is not about corporate profits any longer. We are all done laying down. For years, the middle class has given back. For years. And corporate profits in this not-for-profit hospital have gone stand by and allow your jobs to be given away, your wages to be given away, so that the very top can be successful and we have to struggle. We are done making sure the kids are okay, that our seniors, all the things they talk.
This battle, fortified by the knowledge that we are not alone, that our struggle is a noble one, that on this day, in this place, we stood tall, we stood together, and we said, this is my community hospital. I am L&M. And I can tell you that your fight is our fight. Last year, while they're cutting first-line staff that works with direct care patients. So that's wrong. That's what's wrong with healthcare. So this fight is our fight, and we're next door, and we're here to support you anytime. Inspire us with patience before profits. They got us mixed up somehow.
What a great afternoon.
They got us mixed up somehow.
What a great afternoon. And you know what? The sun is shining on all of us here right now. And if that's not a great sign for the success that you're going to bring to our community to care for our families, our patients, our community.
Who are you?
Our patients, our community.
Who are you? That's right. You're not a building. You hold the hands, every one of you. And I want to thank you for that. So shame on Cummings and shame on the board of directors, because this is your hospital. Board of directors, because this is your hospital. These people here, not that building, you. And thank you very much. The hospital behind you is a not-for-profit, which means that all this land in our very small city is off our tax. This land in our very small city is off our tax rolls. Every taxpayer in our city, to the tune of millions of dollars, subsidizes our not-for-profit community hospital. And how have they behaved? With $200 million in Cayman Island bank accounts, attesting to the state of Rhode Island about their great financial health, so they can buy Westerly Hospital, so they can open new cancer centers, so they can buy more property in our city. They have plenty of money to invest in buildings. We want them to invest in our community. You know, a couple months ago, when this began, the hospital came to me and asked if they could rent Ocean Beach so that they could park replacement workers there. You But they also underestimated New London, because New London is a union town. New London knows how to fight back, and I told them to take a hike. New London doesn't stand with scabs. New London stands with our nurses. New London stands with our healthcare providers. All of New London stands with you, because New London is L&M. We are L&M. We are L&M. Because I know you want to be in there working, right? I know you want to be in there working, right? You want to be in there taking care of patients. That is what you do as well as any hospital in the United States of America. The nurses and everybody out here are great. The nurses and everybody out here are great healthcare providers. And I am so proud to be with you today. So proud to be with people who take care of other people when they need that care the most. There is no place the most. There is no place for lockouts. There is no place for lockouts. And I want to make sure that you are back on the job, providing the kind of health care that makes us proud, under conditions and terms makes us proud, under conditions and terms that are fair to you. That's all you want, right? Is fairness and justice. And I believe we can do it. You should never feel that you are alone. I am with you. Connect. Keep the faith. Thank you so much. God bless you. God bless you.
It means that under the law, they did something they ought not do. And therefore, if they don't negotiate, we have no choice but to try to act. That's what an unfair labor practice strike means. This is not a strike for wages, not hospitals. To the proposition that to heal the community, to be part of the community. That's what this hospital has always stood for. And that's why the nurses hospital in New London have been the same. Frankly, most people in New London didn't know that. Most people in Connecticut didn't know that. Nobody wants to be on strike, but if you are not, that's what it's about. It's about fairness. It's about quality care. It's about making sure its promises to the New London community about when it says.
A third city-state was officially created in 1982. That city-state is called the District of Columbia and is located on 10 square miles of land in the heart of Washington. The District of Columbia flies its own flag and has its own independent constitution. Although geographically separate, the city-states of London, the Vatican, and the District of Columbia are one interlocking empire called Empire of the City. The flag of Washington's District of Columbia has 3 red stars, one for each city-state in the 3-city empire. This corporate empire of 3 city-states controls the world economically through London's inner city, militarily through the District of Columbia, and spiritually through the Vatican. The Constitution for the District of Columbia operates under a tyrannical Roman law known as Lex Fori, which bears no resemblance to the U.S. Constitution. When Congress passed the Act of 1871, it created a separate corporate government for the District of Columbia. This treasonous act allowed the District of Columbia to operate as a corporation outside the original Constitution of the United States and outside of the best interests of American citizens. A sobering study of the signed treaties and charters between Britain and the United States exposes a shocking truth. The United States has always been, and still is, a British Crown colony. King James I was famous not for just changing the Bible into the King James Version. The charter granted America's British forefathers a license to settle and colonize America. The charter also guaranteed that future kings and queens of England would have sovereign authority over all the citizens and colonized land in America stolen from the Indians. After America declared its independence from Great Britain, it identifies the King of England as the Prince of the United States and contradicts the belief that America won the War of Independence. Although King George III of England gave up most of his claims over his American colonies, he kept his right to continue receiving payment for his business venture of colonizing. Really won the War of Independence, they would never have agreed to pay debts and reparations to the King of England. When Congress passed the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, the U.S. President was made subservient to the King of England. The 13th Amendment is called the Title of Nobility Amendment, and forbids U.S. is called the Title of Nobility Amendment, and forbids U.S. presidents and their officials from using royal titles like king or prince or baron. For some mysterious reason, the 13th Amendment, which was ratified in 1810, no longer appears on current copies of the Constitution. America's blood-soaked War of Independence against America's blood-soaked War of Independence against the British bankrupted America and turned its citizens into permanent debt slaves of the king. In the War of 1812, the British torched and burned to the ground the White House and all U.S. government buildings, and destroyed ratification records of the U.S. buildings, and destroyed ratification records of the U.S. Constitution. 1 century later, a corrupt U.S. Congress committed the biggest theft in world history. They passed Paul Warburg's Federal Reserve Act in 1913, handing over America's gold and silver reserves and total control of America's economy to the Rothschild banksters. Most Americans still believe that the Fed, or Federal Reserve, is the government. It is not. The Fed is a privately owned banking system whose majority Class A shareholders are the Rothschilds, Warburgs, Kuhn and Loeb, J.P. Morgan. Rockefeller is the Fed and is never audited and never pays taxes. They print and design America's money, which displays their symbols of an Egyptian pyramid, a Masonic all-seeing eye, and the words "In God We Trust." Who exactly is the God they trust? They also collect American taxpayers' money through the IRS. American presidents are handpicked and financed by these special interest power groups. Like George W. Bush, John Forbes Kerry, whose initials are JFK, is a member of Yale University's Skull-Tendency from Captain Robert Bennett Forbes, who was a drug runner for the Rothschilds' opium drug trade with China in the 1800s. Most U.S. citizens believe that the United States is a country and that the president is the most powerful man on earth. The United States is not a country. It is a corporation of the United States. He and his elected officials work for the corporation, not for the American people. Since the United States is a corporation, who owns the corporation of the United States? Like Canada and Australia, whose leaders are prime ministers of the Queen, and whose land is called Crown land, the United States is just another crown colony. Crown colonies are controlled by the empire of 3 city-states. At the center of each city-state is a towering, phallic-shaped stone monument called an obelisk that points skyward. In D.C. city-state, the obelisk, known as the Washington Monument, was dedicated to Freemason George Washington by the Freemason Grand Lodge of the District of Columbia.
Who's really behind what's going on in this country? None of this is an accident. This is orchestrated. This has been planned and plotted. It is moving right along. What's going on? Who's really behind it? And nobody does that behind it. And nobody does that better than Dr. Coleman. And this is the only country left that stands between that and the New World Order, which will drastically change everybody's lives. He has first-hand experience with most of the things that are going on here. He's also in the Kane Museum in Egypt, the Congressional Records tree. And he would feel very comfortable, in debating the Supreme Court justice on the Constitution at any time, because our Constitution is basically being walked all over. But at this time, I'd like to bring on Dr. Coleman.
Thank you here this morning. A message that I hope will galvanize us all into much needed action. Anarchy and chaos prevails in Washington, D.C. because the federal government has seized powers percent unconstitutional. Now, I'm paranoid, but let me tell you what the real meaning of the word paranoid is. It is a man or a person who has the ability to link events. That's seemingly true meaning of paranoia, or being paranoid. How many times haven't I heard it said of me, that fellow's paranoid? Yes, I'm glad to admit it, because I have the ability to connect events that are seemingly unconnected. And when you do that, you begin to arrive at the truth. When you do that, you begin to arrive at the truth. It's taken me 25 years to come to the conclusions that I have come to. And I want to tell you that one of the biggest things I discovered in my work was a supranational committee composed of 300 men. I came across this quite by accident when I was serving in Africa, in Angola, and I was given a series of documents which were only supposed to be handed in to top-level people. They were what we called, in the black African countries, and that I was actually working for a committee called the Committee of 300, also known in intelligence circles as the Olympians. In 1986, I wrote a work called Mind Control, Metaphysics, Extremely Low Frequency Radiation, and Weather Modifications. And in that work, July the 8th, 1986, I said that the top-level intelligence organization in the United States was the National Reconnaissance Office. And I even had the audacity to give the address of this organization. It took me 5 years of digging in the British Museum in London, which I consider to be the finest repository of knowledge in the world. Today, we are being driven on our knees. The States of America, which is the second greatest document in the world next to the Bible, against the mighty powers of King George III, the most potent force in the world at that time. Then, ladies and gentlemen, it is time that we rebelled against a federal government of the week. But more than that, he sent Adam Smith, a servant of the British East India Company, to formulate a policy which he called free trade. Let me tell you unequivocally that free trade is piracy. There is no such thing as free trade. We have to reject to which we are subjected. Free trade began with Adam Smith and the British East India Company. Now, who is the British East India Company? They played a massive role. In my book, The Committee of 300, which took 20 years of research, and incidentally, I was only a little bit behind with Karl Marx. He spent 30 years in the British Museum in London, where he got most of these things from. I point out that the British East India Company was the most powerful trading company in the world. They made their massive monies out of the dope trade. They first grew prime poppies in Kew Gardens in Kensington. London, got the best producing opium poppies. They then shipped them to Benares in India, where they began a massive plantation of poppies, opium-producing poppies. They then used their famous tea clippers to transport the poppies in the form of raw opium to China. And by their military force, they imposed an opium policy on China that turned the Chinese nation into a nation of addicts. and they enforced this policy, which was known to the royal family and Lord Gladstone, the Prime Minister, and every one of the lords and ladies in England. And they made a massive, huge fortune. In researching these documents in India House in London, I came across some of the manifests of the old tea clippers and the numbers of kegs of opium they carried and the values. And I totaled up these things, and I found to my astonishment, in General Motors and Ford, in 1 year, the opium trade with China was 3 times the profits of the combined profits of Ford and General Motors in 1970. And this was shared by 3 British East India Companies. They all had equal voting rights. They could not outvote each other, and of course they were sworn to secrecy. The descendants of the British East India Company today run the United States. And I will hope to prove my thesis as based on every occasion. They armed the Indians, they armed the people against the settlers who were pushing west. They ran the Hudson's Bay Company. They also ran so-called mission stations in China and got these missionaries who were really not missionaries at all to push opium on the Chinese. And I remember late Gamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt, Prime Minister of Egypt, President of Egypt, and Mohammed Aikel, one of the top journalists, with Chow En-lai. And Chow En-lai told him, he said, you know, the Americans and the British made China a nation of opium addicts, and now with the Vietnam War, it's our turn. We are opium addicts, and now with the Vietnam War, it's our turn. We are going to make the Americans a nation of opium addicts. So you can see the influence, the evil, baleful influence of the British East India Company upon the great nation of the United States of America. They were the ones who financed the war. They put up the money, the ones who financed the war. They put up the money for the British troops to buy the Hessian mercenaries and to fight the colonists. Those brave 3%, let me remind you that only 3% of the people took arms and stood up against the mighty army of King George III. We are 3% here this morning, but that's enough for us to withstand the mighty force of the federal government of the United States of America. These 300 men in the Committee of 300 still run the world today with an iron fist. Their wealth is untold, cannot be measured. I know I looked at some of the records that I could find in Italy, in Rome. I've done most, and I came across the families in Italy who were called the fondi, meaning the people who had all the money. They were all members of the Committee of 300, the Lucatis, the Recanatis, the Volpi du Miseratis. These people are so wealthy that they would make David Rock. This is the committee that runs the world. Now, in my book, The Committee of 300, I name every one of them. On July the 4th, 1789, George Washington told the Congress, it is necessary for us to impose tariffs. And he ordered British MI6 to assassinate Lincoln, which is what they did. The same way as British MI6 publicly executed President John F. Kennedy at a later time of the world. And I'm going to leave that subject for now and return to it later. The thing is the type of questions that are most often asked of me. I've dealt with that. I've told you this is a supranational body that knows no boundaries, respects the laws of no countries. Are 300 men that rule the world. They are known only to each other, and nothing happens. They are known only to each other, and nothing happens without their consent. When former head of state Mikhail Gorbachev visited the United States a few years ago, flanked by George Bush and Quayle, he opened his Gorbachev Foundation in the United States. And he let slip, he said, This is being done with approval of the Committee of 300. CNN cameras were on him. They immediately switched. Nothing ever came of it. The federal government, the secret ever came of it. The federal government, the secret upper-level parallel government that runs the United States, does not want you to know that you have an upper-level parallel government that calls the shots, that dictates what is going to happen to you, calls the shots, that dictates what is going to happen to your life and mine. So that's how I found out about the Committee of 300. The next question is, what are their goals? Their goals are a one-world government, latterly called the New World Government, latterly called the New World Order. The one world government began with King George III. At the time that the colonists were brave enough to take him on, King George was already busy formulating a one world government, and he had lined up at least 50 countries that were willing to come into this future world dictatorship with him. The goals then, very simply stated, are to make the world over into a one world New World Order dictatorship, controlled utterly and completely by this Committee of 300. How can they possibly carry out their goals? That's the next question that I'm often asked. They do it by dint and by virtue of their fantastic wealth and the fact that they control thousands of the top banking institutions, the political organizations, insurance companies. In fact, one of the giant insuring the Metropolitan of New York, I said, the Metropolitan of New York is peanuts. He said, how can you say that? That's a giant American company. I said, well, compared with the Assicurenzi, the Generali di Venezia, it's peanuts. That's the biggest insurance company in the world. They control that organization. Everything that happens in the world, in the Venice, is so important because in Venice we have the black nobility. Now that has nothing to do with the color of the skin of the people, and I'm going to come back to them as we go along. So the goals are a one-world dictatorship of the most brutal kind, and how they carry it out is they have these interface banks, insurance, in politics, including the goals of the old Socialist Party USA, i.e. based upon the Communist Manifesto of 1848. If you have a copy of my book, and I'm not pushing it, but in my book, The Committee of 300, I list every one of their huge, to the nitty-gritty life in the cities and towns across the United States. So they carry out their goals through existing organizations. And also, of course, they have built up some special organizations of their own. When I first started writing in America when I came here in 1969, I revealed the existence of an organization called the Royal Institute for International Affairs, which is located at Chatham House in 10 St. James Square in London. I also revealed the existence of the Club of Rome. The Cini Foundation, the Mont Pelerin Society, the Order of St. John, which is known but not known. And I listed all of these secret societies that run the world as executive arms of the Committee of 300. So it controls the world through all of these. The Royal Institute for International Affairs is the executive arm of this committee, which gives instructions to the United States government to this very day. The chain of command is as follows. Every Secretary of State that has been appointed since 1919 is appointed by the Royal Institute for International Affairs. That may come as a shock for you. You think you vote and you put a conservative in the White House, and then he appoints supposedly or allegedly conservative people to. I ask you to find me a conservative Secretary of State since 1919. And if you search diligently and apply the correct rules, you'll come out blank. Every one of the Secretaries of State was chosen in London by the Secretary of State, as was James Earl Carter. He was specially chosen because he'd had 3 mental breakdowns, and they felt he would be a good guy to manipulate the neck. But James Earl Carter was not a known entity in the American scene. I first heard of him through my intelligence contacts, particularly my French sources. He was going to be a peanut farmer from Georgia. And I said, how come? He said, right now they're meeting at the Dorchester Hotel in London. And if you get your fanny over there, he said, you'll find that there's a lot of goings-on you might like to look at. And lo and behold, that's what was happening. The International Affairs had ordered David Rockefeller to find a candidate who was totally weak, preferably a little mentally weak. And they took one of the greatest brainwashing specialists in the world, trained by the Tavistock Institute for Human Relations, Dr. Peter Bourne, on the job. And he said, Dr. Peter Bourne, on the job. And he said, well, it's funny you should say that. One of my patients is a guy from... Clinton went up there, brushing his forelock back, said, well, you know, there's one problem. My wife's left me. So Mrs. Harriman was dumbfounded. She said, well, you better give it back in a hurry. So Mrs. Harriman was dumbfounded. She said, well, you better give it back in a hurry. And he said, no, she doesn't want to come back to me because of my trice with other women. That's how he put it. My philanderings would have been a better word, but he said trice with other women. So Mrs. Harriman, the woman. So Mrs. Harriman sent for Mrs. Clinton, and she duly came to New York, and she sat her down and said, look, if you want to be the first lady of America with all the attendant prestige and power, you better forget about your husband's philanderings and get right back to him. And that is precisely what happened. And when I heard that had happened, I knew this guy was the next president. And we wrote that in our news magazine. And sure enough, a year later, here came marching into the scene William Jefferson Clinton. So the RIA, the Royal Institute for International Affairs, does go to the Morgan Guarantee and Trust Bank on Wall Street. And the chief executive officer of that organization is Dennis Weatherstone. The word, and I apologize to the ladies for this, but I need to tell you this graphically to illustrate the power that the Royal Institute for International Affairs exercised. Bush was hesitating and didn't know whether he should get into the Gulf or not. The Prime Minister of Britain, Mrs. Margaret Thatcher, came over to the Committee of 300's headquarters at the Aspen Institute, Colorado, and this is the phone call that she had with George Bush. You ladies president, get your ass up here. I've got some orders for you about the Gulf War. And Bush went scurrying up there like a little messenger boy. And the next thing we know, there was this massive outpouring of propaganda to start a war against the nation of Iran, a nation that had never done this country one iota of harm. I use those illustrations in order to give you the extent of the control that is exercised by this Committee of 300. Don't you believe it? 13 of the top families in the United States are in the Illuminati today, and they have a big say on every Illuminati today, and they have a big say on everything that happens politically in this country. Then we have the Society of Cincinnati, which I don't think many of you will have heard about. That is an ultra secret society to which every president of the United States is forced to belong, including our so-called conservative presidents, and forced to belong, including our so-called conservative presidents. And I point this out to you to show you that it doesn't matter who is in the White House. This Committee of 300, through the Royal Institute for International Affairs, through the Council on Foreign Relations, exercises complete control. But their exercises complete control. But their strongest arm is called the Club of Rome. Now, when I first heard of the Club of Rome in 1969, the Club of Rome is one of the most insidious, baneful organizations in existence today, which has done immeasurable harm to the United States of America. The world is grossly overpopulated, and we have to get rid of at least half of the world's population, and it doesn't matter how we do it. But they put this aristocrat onto the job of destroying first the steel industry. In my book in 1980, I said the rolling herbal compounds mixed with sugar, and they also have, of course, the protection of extremely low frequency radiation, where using the technology developed by the great virologist Goethe to prove that every living thing on the of the vileness and the evilness of their deeds. These families date back to the 11th centuries, the Locatis, the Reconnatis. They were called, and the Guelphs, by the way, I'll come to them, they're particularly interesting. They were called that because of the evilness of their deeds. They make Lucrezia Borgia look like money, which is the outcome of the drug trade, the years of investing, the years of gaining control of every mining, mineral, gold, oil, natural resource of the world, that they can afford to finance these things. So the black nobility of the ancient aristocrats of Venice and Genoa, and they called that because of the nature of their deeds. The black Guelphs were one of the worst of them. Now, interesting enough, the Queen of England, Queen Elizabeth II, is a Guelph. She's not a Windsor. This was a title that was evolved in 1935 by her father to put researchers off the track. I like to include myself in that category, although I wasn't doing it then, I was much too young to be doing it, but he didn't like that certain people were getting hot on the track of who this royal family actually was, and so this was put out that they are the House of Windsor. They are not, they're the House of Guelph, and it's important for us to know that, because every time there's a financial crisis, it follows a meeting of the black Guelphs upon the Royal Britannia yacht of the Queen of England, which anchors off the coast of Venice. And all the world bankers meet over there and say, now this is what we're going to do to country X. This is how we're going to say, now this is what we're going to do to country X. This is how we're going to control this worldwide situation. And then they go up and give their orders to everybody. So that is the way it is done. I told you earlier that they controlled the United States even in the days of President Lincoln. They had him assassinated on the orders of Disraeli. And they then, of course, in later years, were able to elect one of the worst socialists we've ever had the misfortune to suffer under, Woodrow Wilson. Wilson was elected by a ploy. Of course, they got Teddy Roosevelt and the Bull Moose Party running as a Wilson could be elected as a socialist president. Now, our eyes have been fixed on Moscow. We've been led down the garden path, ladies and gentlemen. All of the time we've been looking at Moscow. We've been told what demons they are in Moscow. Rightly so. But all the time this was going on, the Trojan horse was away from us. And in my book, Socialism, The Road to Slavery, I give you a full and factual description of exactly how this was done. In 1898, the Fabian Society, a socialist organization, sent Ramsay MacDonald, Prime Minister of England, to the United States to spy out the land. Middle class, and you have the Constitution of the United States, both of which have got to be destroyed before we can socialize America. The first step they took was getting a socialist president in office in the form of Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson was controlled out of England by Sir William Wiseman, head of the North American desk of MI6. Now, in case you don't know MI6, it is the most powerful and the oldest of all intelligence agencies in the world. They taught the CIA. They taught the Vatican. They taught the CIA. They taught the Vatican intelligence. They taught the French intelligence. They taught the Mossad. They taught the Cheka. Captain Hill of MI6 went out and set up the Mossad. And Captain Hill went to Russia and helped the Bolsheviks set up their single-cell apparatus, and helped the Bolsheviks set up their single-cell apparatus. Sir William Wiseman was the controller of Wilson through Colonel House. Now, who is Colonel House? He was an unknown person who emerged out of Texas. His father served the Rothschilds during the Civil War. Emerged out of Texas. His father served the Rothschilds during the Civil War, and he emerged out of the war as the only person in Texas who'd made any money. And House was sent to Washington in order to control the first socialist president, and he took his orders from Weizmann. And House lived but a few blocks away from Wilson, and above Weizmann had an apartment. And that type of control is not gone. It is still here to this very day, right now, as I speak to you. Other questions. Give us some examples of what you're talking. How do we know that what you're saying is true? I'll refer you to the great soldier son of the United States of America, a great Christian. When Douglas MacArthur was in Korea, he and General Stratemeyer of the Air Force devised a plan that would have put China out of action for the next 50 years. He submitted this plan to Washington, was served by the name of Dean Rusk, immediately summoned the President of the United States to a meeting in Blair House. And he said, Mr. President, we have seen the plan submitted by General Douglas MacArthur, and there's no way in the world that you can allow him to implement that anything that relates to China has to be cleared by the Royal Institute for International Affairs first. And he said, they don't want you to do this. And MacArthur was not allowed to carry out his plan. And 50,000 sons, beautiful Americans, were slaughtered on the battlefields of Korea needlessly because of orders from the Royal Institute for International Affairs. And that same institute is controlling President William Jefferson Clinton to this day. MacArthur was eventually bowler-hatted on the orders of the British government. I mentioned earlier the death of John F. Kennedy. Given the methods that are well known in intelligence circles of how to get rid of bothersome people, it would have been a very simple management. It would have been a very simple management to make it look as though Kennedy had died of a heart attack or some other natural cause. Instead of that, in order to warn every president that would follow in his wake, every powerful person in this country in the know, you do not kick over the traces. You obey us, or you will see what will happen to you. Kennedy was publicly and brutally executed in a plan carried out by a British under the control of Sir William Stevenson and his lieutenant, a Canadian citizen by the name of Major Louis Mortimer Bloomfield. Now, you won't get that in any of the accounts of the Kennedy assassination. You'll find it in my book, The Committee of 300. You'll also find it in my monograph. William Stevenson ran American intelligence throughout the Second World War out of the RCA building in New York. His second in command, a Canadian citizen, Major Louis Mortimer Bloomfield, ran Division 5 of the FBI counterintelligence. You want examples of how Britain, every Secretary of State since 1919 is selected by the Royal Institute for International Affairs on the orders of the Committee of 300. Why is this? We go to these conventions and there's all the hoopla in the world. The balloons are flying, the straw voters are in the air. Bush has been elected. In reality, the Secretary of State, who's charged with carrying out the policies, subverts each and every one of them. You show me a Secretary of State that has acted in the best interest of the United States of America since 1919, and I will give you that acted in the best interest of the United States of America since 1919, and I will give you the only money that I've got in the bank, which is about $1,500. You're welcome to it, because I know that you will not be able to do that. Every Secretary of State has subverted and acted in a treasonable manner at $1,500. You're welcome to it, because I know that you will not be able to do that. Every Secretary of State has subverted and acted in a treasonable manner towards the people of this great country. And when they haven't done it directly, they've done it through surrogates like Lachlan Burden, and acted in a treasonable manner towards the people of this great country. And when they haven't done it directly, they've done it through surrogates like Lachlan Curry, who ordered the military to jettison a shipment of arms destined for the great Chinese. They've done it directly, they've done it through surrogates like Lachlan Curry, who ordered the military to jettison a shipment of arms destined for the great Chinese leader Chiang Kai-shek, to jettison overboard these arms in the Indian Ocean. And that's exactly what they did. We think that we elect our presidents. Ladies and gentlemen, we do not elect our presidents. They are selected for us long before we've even heard of them. And I've given you 2 examples this morning of how this is done. The 300th political event that takes place in this country. And it was this office, through Margaret Thatcher, that ordered President Bush to violate the Constitution of the United States of America and to violate his own personal oath to uphold the laws of the United States by sending our troops to the Gulf. And we did it by the dirtiest of dirtiest tricks. We got the daughter of one of the Al-Shabaab clan, there are over 400 of these people, and these are the most degenerate. The ruler has 140 wives. He doesn't have them all at the same time. When he gets tired of one, he says, I divorce thee 3 times, and she's gone. 140 marriage certificates. This is the man that your sons and your daughters are propping up today in Kuwait in a most illegal manner, in violation of the Constitution of the United States of America. And Bush did a Texas two-step around the Constitution. In so-called police actions, the president has 45 days to use only one branch of the service. Bush violated his oath of office by going to the United Nations, to which we do not belong, and getting them to give him a so-called, and since then they've been to give him a so-called, and since then they've been stealing the oil off Iran, and the proceeds go to the British banks in the city of London for the Committee of 300. They're just doing the same thing now in South Africa with the gold. That's part of their tactics to gain control of all natural resources through the world. I also touched all natural resources through the world. I also touched briefly on Giovanni Agnelli and Mrs. Clinton and how she had left her husband. I personally am not in favor of political parties. Unlike George Washington, he said, political parties are baneful. He said, political parties are baneful, and in the long run they are harmful. But this is the first time you're going to hear this now of the scandal where our prisoners were kept there until Reagan was elected the president, of how bad your Republicans are, President Bush. And on the strength of that, of the decadent Al-Shabaab family, whose money goes to the Royal Institute of International Affairs banks in London, to deal with it and push it into a socialist new world order, a one world government. To go to Washington and stand from today, all of these unconstitutional measures will be rolled back and a new system will come into being. The Federal Reserve Bank, that private enterprise bank, will be put out of business.
Members, and particularly those from the Jewish community, who are angry, hurt, and offended that this event is taking place, and they have called for its cancellation. We very much regret that this is the case. However, it remains the library's belief that we must stand by the principle of freedom of expression, and therefore the decision was made not to cancel it. The selection of materials collected and presented at Vancouver Public Library is based on the belief that every person has the right to access all expressions of knowledge, opinion, and creativity, and express their thoughts publicly within the limits set by law. This freedom of access is essential to the health and development of a democratic society. However, freedom cannot be limited by the personal views of any group or individual, even the majority. Greg Felton's new book, The Host and the Parasite, is such a book. He has a bachelor's degree in Russian studies and a master's degree in political science from the University of British Columbia. With that, I will now introduce Greg Fell.
Those who have looked at the United States over the last 8 years can only look with sadness and despair at what has happened to what used to be a republic. For 225 years, the United States has been at least nominally supportive of things like individual rights, protection of the person, the rights against the accused, the right against illegal search and seizure. And now, as we look around, we have the United States becoming the apotheosis, the very opposite of what it started out to be. Torture is now officially justified as national policy. The United States has declared war on its own citizens. People can be warranted. Wiretaps are allowed without judicial permission, much of it earned during the time of George W. Bush. And over this time, we are supposed to think of the United States as a republic, as the same country that you and I grew up with, affection for the United States, peace, justice, and the American way. Well, that no longer applies. That the United States is fundamentally different than what it was during the 1950s and 60s, or even the 1970s. And because of that, I think I'd like to explain why this change took place. The United States went downhill when George W. Until Bill Clinton was, while Bill Clinton was president, we had a pretty good time. September the 11th, knocked down a couple of buildings, led to the passage of the USA Patriot Act. And from there, people might argue, we went into torture and all other sorts of things you can associate with undemocratic activity. Well, if you do that, you end up with a problem. And the problem is this. On October 3rd, 2001, 24 days after September the 11th happened, the Department of Justice handed Congress a document. It was called the Patriot Act. And Congress was told to pass it. Now, Congress is a legislative body. It's the body that makes laws. But here we have a Congress being told to follow a diktat from the executive, which is kind of weird. At least Congress should have the right of oversight. Congress should at least evaluate it, discuss it, debate it. Congress should at least evaluate it, discuss it, debate it. The Patriot Act was entered into the House October 23rd and signed by Bush on October 26th. But that document did something very strange and very sad, as it legislated the Republic. But that document did something very strange and very sad, as it legislated the Republic out of existence. That document killed the Republic and turned the United States into a proto-fascist empire, legally. But if we start from this perspective and think the United States went downhill from this date legally, but if we start from this perspective and think the United States went downhill from this date, we end up with a problem. We have to explain why a Congress would commit political suicide. Why would Congress do this? Well, if you have Congress comprised of Republicans and Democrats, Congress do this. Well, if you have Congress comprised of Republicans and Democrats who are democratic, it doesn't make any sense. You don't just commit suicide like that. Well, my book takes a perspective that Congress was incapable of defending the Constitution, which of course the Patriot Act utterly destroys. It is my view that the United States went downhill not beginning with George W. Bush, but beginning with Ronald Reagan in 1980. And through a period of 25 years, the United States managed to mutate from a republic slowly toward a police state because of events that came out of the Vietnam War. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go back a bit to the climate of the 1960s and describe for you what happened. The United States was fighting two battles at once, Vietnam and Lyndon Johnson's Great Society, the people. One was evangelical Christians, the passage of the Roe versus Wade decision, which made abortion legal upon demand, or at least decriminalized it. In that same year, Paul Weyrich, the very first so-called conservative think tank, so to all intents and purposes, for the Heritage Foundation, so-called neocons, because they follow the teachings of a professor called Leo Strauss, a very influential Jewish professor who left New York, went to Washington, D.C., and helped turn Leo Strauss's philosophy of a major economic movement. Leo Strauss believed that a government had a right to lie to its own people, to keep truths from them, not to give people, the common people, any sort of help, because that would weaken the fiber of American society. And America had to be strong to face up to the threats of the communists and the fascists and all this sort of stuff. The third group were called Jewish Zionists. Norman Podhoretz, Irving Kristol, Charles Krauthammer, Paul Wolfowitz, Richard Pearl, a whole list of individuals whom George H.W. Bush would collectively call the crazies. These people together formed what I fascist troika, the fascist undercurrent that had been extant in the United States culture for some time, but had not risen to any sort of political prominence, because, for the most part, radical religion, although practiced in the United States, was not really welcome at the highest levels. The separation was still at least nominally respected. And because of this, it was very difficult to profess open support for evangelical Christianity. And for Jews, it was difficult also, because until the 1967 war, Jewish Americans were very concerned that they might be considered somewhat if they harbored a dual allegiance to Israel. So for up until 1967, the Holocaust and other sorts of Zionist issues were kept very much out of the public view. They were very personal. They were not to be discussed. And then 1967 happened, war in the Middle East, and managed to seize control of the Suez. It occupied East Jerusalem, the Golan Heights, Suez, the West Bank, Gaza Strip. It is still an illegal occupation of much of that territory today. So by the time 1973 comes around, we have three evangelical Christians, Jewish Zionists, and Straussian neoconservatives, neither one of which has any regard for America. What happened then, during this period, which was a reaction against the populism of the 60s, came to a particularly interesting with Jimmy Carter's victory over Gerald Ford to turn its back on the Vietnam War. The cruelty, the sadism, the lies, the corruption, the violence perpetrated in the name of a misbegotten war, and turn their minds forward to look for something else. And Ford was a remnant of the old country, though a very good man. Carter was an evangelical Christian, a Baptist. He made it possible for Christians to come out from the closet, so to speak, and profess both a political and a religious identity. Is that, with respect to the Middle East, he was not there to represent the United States. He was there to represent, well, Israel. Because soon after he was elected, now I'm talking about 1977 March in Clinton, Massachusetts, he delivered a speech where he spoke, urgently, I think, about the need for a Palestinian homeland. Well, the Israel lobby basically had a collective heart attack. They assailed him, they slandered him, they libeled him, they attacked him vigorously, but it was too late. The Israel lobby, which came to prominence under Harry and owed its allegiance to the Democratic Party, was for the first time considering supporting a Republican candidate for president, Ronald Reagan. Was that the Zionists, both Christian and Jewish, and the neocons, came to power, and their front man, and the neocons came to power, and their front man was Ronald Reagan. And to the 1980s, we have a transition period. A transition period between the role of oil as the dominant influence and cause of U.S. policy in the Middle East. Oil as the dominant influence and cause of U.S. policy in the Middle East. And that of supporting Israel to the detriment of oil and to the detriment of the United States. The Ozark nuclear power plant in Iraq. It did so illegally, using American weaponry in Iraq. It did so illegally, using American weaponry, contrary to the U.S. Procurement Act, using U.S. satellite technology, contrary to U.S. law. and the United States did nothing about it. And Reagan saw pictures of bombed out cities about it. And Reagan saw pictures of bombed out cities and children burnt beyond recognition. And Reagan, for all of his faults, was a very moral man. He had a sense of humanity. And he told Reagan he had enough of this. He wanted to stop doing it. Throughout the 1980s, Israel ignored everything the United States wanted to do in the Middle East. Well, three reasons, actually. Iraq has a lot of oil. Israel needs oil. Iraq has a lot of water. The Tigris and the Euphrates are within the ambit of what is called the courageous enough to stand up against the repression and the sadism of the Israeli state. The occupation is to this day illegal, but it's hard to find any outlet in the media willing to say this. So Saddam Hussein was a political problem and also the head of a country that was the capital of the Arab world, culturally speaking, Baghdad, and Hussein had a good army. But armies in the Middle East are not something Israel wants on its doorstep. Israel wants to have complete military superiority over the region. And so we had a provocation to bomb Iraq. Again, we have to understand, especially since Clinton, has been populated by people who owe more of an allegiance to Israel than to the United States itself. To this day, there are people in the American government who are citizens of Israel. And to have a dual citizen formally policy that a republic could commit suicide by passing the Patriot Act. But it makes more sense to believe that Israel, the United States Congress, is not in control of itself. The people making policy. The Patriot Act, in my view, represents the culminating act of the fascist coup d'etat. Now, it was a coup d'etat that happened with the willingness and support of the American public. People who told us what we wanted to hear. People who were less intellectual than they were jingoistic and rah-rah, energetic Americans. Ronald Reagan had no business being president, but he spoke to the Republican credibility. I mean, to this day, the United States has something called the Strategic Oil Reserve Agreement with Israel, under which it will guarantee to supply Israel with oil in the event of a crisis, even to the extent of denying oil to its own people. The United States has abused, disgraced, internationally and domestically, as it moves to support Israel in whatever it does. And it is impossible to think that this is being done willingly, that the United States is the same country that existed in the 1960s and 70s. The possible thing that we can conclude is that the United States has been under Israeli occupation to all intents and purposes. I think that's hilarious. The military-industrial complex is a very good example for the United States to repudiate its own principles and declare war on its own citizens. The sense of this is that the people in Washington are serving another government, that we have essentially a treasonous government. And in fact, if you know how both Bush stole the last two elections, was not legitimately elected. We have to look at the sort of gangsterism that we most the mafia or some other sort of organized crime. There is no other way to explain the United States from a rational point of view. It cannot be done. There is no rational explanation for the United States behavior. And we look at the events of September the 11th and how that happened. We end up with conclusions that the United States has been dominated by interest groups that put the interests of America behind that of Israel. I have a number of other things I could say, but I don't want to speak for too much longer, and I will give the floor over to questions. Menachem Begin, in 1982, said in the New York Times, the Egyptian army's concentrations in the Sinai did not prove that Nasser was really ready to attack us. We must be honest with ourselves. We decided to attack him. Moreover, Moshe Dayan stated that Israel made repeated border provocations against Syria in the north. And at the time, Syria and Egypt had a mutual defense pact, that if one were attacked, the other were attacked. The other would come to his defense. testified to a military defensive operation. Moreover, Nasser, 100,000 of Nasser's backed down in a war in Yemen. He had neither the manpower nor the artillery, and Israel was planning to execute Egyptian prisoners of war. It could not afford to have the United States Liberty listen in on the communications. They did not want to be caught committing a war crime, because a war criminal wants to do its dirty work in prime. Dozens upon dozens of soldiers, seamen, American sailors were murdered, deliberately murdered. And Lyndon Johnson covered this up because he would not acknowledge that Israel committed a mass murder, and the documentation of this is irrefutable and its extent, and anyone who wants to investigate it may do so. Crime against the United States, and if anyone else had done it, the United States would have gone to war. But Israel gets away with murder literally, because Israel is Israel. And the connection between Zionist money, influence, coercion, and power, the Zionists actively took part in the extermination of European. And that is something, whether you like to believe it or not, is actually written, discussed. And if you want to see who did it, a Zionist writer named Edwin Black wrote a book called The Transfer Agreement. And it outlines in painstaking, sad, disgusting detail the collusion of the Zionists with the Nazis. Wrote a book called The Transfer Agreement. And in painstaking, sad, disgusting detail the collusion of the Zionists with the Nazi Reich to sabotage the Jewish war veterans of America who started the worldwide boycott to bring down Hitler's Germany. That boycott was so effective. Edwin Black. In 1949, Israel was admitted to the United Nations, admitted under UN General Assembly Resolution 273. Israel is the only UN member to be signed in on a conditional basis. It signed a document by which it promised to recompense every Arab displaced by the invasions of 47-48 and to recompense every Arab displaced by the invasions of 47-48 and to return to their homes. And they implicitly accepted the terms of UNGA Resolution 194. And since a GA resolution is enforceable, if both parties agree to be bound by it, Israel has every right, as it is enforceable, if both parties agree to be bound by it, Israel has every right, as obliged by law.
It is important, and I come back to making the statement again, that in presenting a program such as this, the library is not endorsing the views expressed by individual speakers. The library is not endorsing the views expressed by individual speakers. When
the global economy crashed in 2008, costing tens of millions of people their savings, their jobs, and their homes. The bankers who caused the crisis did not get arrested. They did not get jobs in their homes. The bankers who caused the crisis did not get arrested. They did not go to jail. This corrupt network of elite financial criminals has infested itself into the top levels of the U.S. government, military, business, and intelligence sectors. If we don't address this information now, it's only going to get $40 billion covert operations war chest through the purchase of 10-year securities that, as it happened, were scheduled to come due on September 12, 2001. Pockets of these economic hitmen who swooped in to devour the collapsing Russian economy after the fall of the Soviet Union. A spectacular investment for all, at least until money when the 10-year deadline came up and the securities became 39 out of the 40 people who worked in those offices were killed on 9/11, including the entire chain of command. The Pentagon's financial accounting offices in that same wing were also an obvious target, as were the passengers on board Flight 77, many of whom coincidentally held top-secret clearance operations. Agents of the Office of Naval Intelligence had also been investigating financial transactions which were linked to securities being managed by those securities dealers in the World Trade Center that were also targeted. 31% of the 125 fatalities in the Pentagon were from the Naval Command Center that housed the Office of Naval Intelligence. Fatalities in the Twin Towers came from two companies that managed U.S. government securities, Cantor Fitzgerald and Eurobrokers. There were three major security brokers in the World Trade Center, Cantor Fitzgerald, Eurobrokers, and Garvin Intercapital. At 8:46 on the morning of September 11th, Flight 11 flew directly into Marsh & McLennan's security, in which Cantor Fitzgerald was situated. Cantor Fitzgerald was the largest security dealer in the U.S. Shortly after that, a massive explosion went off just under the FBI offices in the North Tower on the 23rd floor, Shortly thereafter, at 9:03, Flight 175 hit the South Tower right below the floors on which the explosive, fiery destruction consumed the offices in the several floors above, destroying files and trapping victims inside. In the midst of all this, Building 6 was destroyed by an explosion that took place before either tower fell. The El Dorado Task Force was an interagency money laundering watchdog group responsible for coordinations in the U.S. Building 6 was located directly between the North Tower and World Trade Center Building 7. While large portions of World Trade Center 6 were gutted by explosions and later by falling debris from the North Tower, the building itself did not suffer a global symmetric collapse at near freefall acceleration as did Buildings 1, 2, and 7. Sunfield took some interesting pictures of the U.S. Customs Vault in the basement of World Trade Center 6, which was found completely empty and left with the door wide open. All of its contents appear to have been looted during the attacks. There is also evidence that gold was being looted from the vaults beneath World Trade Center 4. The Federal Reserve declared gold was being looted from the vaults beneath World Trade Center 4. The Federal Reserve declared an emergency and invoked its emergency powers that very afternoon. On September 14th, the Securities and Exchange Commission declared a national emergency and for the first time in U.S. history invoked its emergency powers under the Securities Exchange Act Section 12K and invoked its emergency powers under the Securities Exchange Act Section 12K and eased regulatory restrictions for clearing and settling security trades for the next 15 days. These changes would have allowed the estimated $240 billion in covert government securities to be cleared upon maturity without the standard regulatory controls around identification of ownership. The towers needed to be demolished to create a big enough mess that the illicit activities taking place behind the scenes that morning could be hidden in the confusion of that day. Okay, now let's talk a little bit about who did it and how that day. Many researchers believe that the MENA operation was moved to Stewart Air Force Base after Barry Seal got whacked. On September 10, 2001, Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld announced that $2.3 trillion in unadjusted funds were missing, whose responsibility it was for tracking that money down were destroyed when American Airlines Flight 77 impacted that very section of the building. The only off-site backup for the Pentagon's black budget financial records was a secure federal office building in the World Trade Center complex. Strangely, it too was destroyed on 9/11. World Trade Center and housed offices involved in several large-scale federal investigations into massive stock market and accounting fraud. Not surprisingly, World Trade Center 7 was the first to be cleaned up and the evidence destroyed at Ground Zero. So if 9/11 was really an inside job, then let's take a look at some of the people inside the buildings that were targeted. The impact zone of the North Tower was a company called Marsh & McLennan, which at the time was the world's largest insurance brokerage company. One of Marsh's executives was a guy named L. Paul Bremer, who was also the chairman of the Congressional National Commission on Terrorism from 1999 to 2000, and the U.S. Ambassador at Large for Counterterrorism. From work on the day of 9/11 and dying inside the towers with hundreds of his employees, Bremer decided to go on MSNBC and tell the world that Osama bin Laden was behind the attacks and possibly Iraq and Iran. L. Paul Bremer was called away from Marsh in 2003 to become the Iraq occupation governor, a role he has been widely criticized for. So Bremer not only worked as governor, a role he has been widely criticized for. So Bremer not only worked inside the buildings, but had offices directly in the impact zone of the South Tower where Flight 175 would hit. He missed work on 9/11 to give us the official story on national television and went on to be the Iraq occupation governor. You really can't get more connected to 9/11 than that. Bremer was also on the Bremer was also on the International Advisory Board for the Japanese mining and machinery company Komatsu, which at the time had been involved in a joint venture agreement with Dresser Industries, the oil services intelligence front where Prescott Bush Sr. and George H.W. Bush got their start with. As many of you know, residues of thermite, a highly energetic chemical mixture, have been confirmed in samples of World Trade Center dust, and the use of thermite at the World Trade Center was also revealed by environmental data. Jim Pierce had arranged a meeting on the 105th floor of the South Tower for that morning. Pierce survived that day despite the fact that 12 people came to the meeting in the South Tower and 11 of them died. The location of the meeting had been changed the night before to the Millennium Hotel, where Pierce watched the South Tower as it was hit by the aircraft. Apparently, the TASC worked with so-called black or top-secret programs. TASC also worked closely with the National Institute of Standards and Technology. Kasputis was also a member of the Logistics Management Institute, LMI, whose members included Paul Kaminsky of In-Q-Tel and General Dynamics, Charles D. Bono, Samuel Nye, and Michael Daniels of Scientific Applications International Corporation. LMI's self-proclaimed role is advancing the science of government. Kasputis' connections to the DOE from 1977 through at least 1997 are interesting, considering that the DOE was developing thermite ignition devices as on to become the CEO of Baseline Financial Services, which was directly in the impact zone on the 78th floor of the South Tower. According to NIST, Kasputis' Baseline Financial modified the southeast corner of floor 78 in 1999, exactly where the aircraft hit on 9/11. Floors 77 and 98 respectively. In 1996, Washington took over Morrison Knudsen, an engineering and construction firm that had a history of working on large-scale projects around the world, including in China, Iran, Afghanistan, and Saudi Arabia. The Army Corps of Engineers hired Morrison Knudsen to demolish over 200 buildings in 1995. The labs and the Savannah River site signed an agreement of cooperation to share technology. Savannah went on to add developing sol gel technology for fuels and other applications to its portfolio. Sol gel technology is utilized by Lawrence Livermore National Laboratories for making nanothermites. In another coincidence, Savannah River took that ground zero by providing, as part of these proceedings, to a number of companies, including Komatsu. Washington also made payments to Greenhorn and Omara, whose employee, Teresa McAllister, was a lead author of the FEMA and NIST reports on the World Trade Center disaster, and to Sumitomo Bank, which was closely allied with Komatsu. Building 7 site, which collapsed at 5:20 p.m. on the afternoon of 9/11. This building was home to the CIA, in fact, the largest CIA headquarters outside of Langley, Virginia. It also housed offices for the Secret Service and the Securities and Exchange Commission. One of the most interesting tenants, however, was then Mayor Giuliani's Office of Emergency Management floor. This floor received $15 million worth of renovations, including independent and secure air and water supplies. Mayor Giuliani was a former U.S. prosecutor for the South District of New York from 1983 to 1989, who was in charge of investigating the terrorist financing Bank of Credit and Commerce International. After he left his job as a prosecutor to start a political career, he worked for a law firm called White & Case that actually represented BCCI. So he went from prosecuting the BCCI to working for a law firm which defended the BCCI. This was likely his foot in the door of this underground corporate criminal network. Giuliani would later help to destroy all the crime scene evidence from Ground Zero. Giuliani's sidekick on 9/11 was Police Commissioner Bernard Kerik, who appeared to be coaching some of Rudy's actions that day, keeping him away from the media, and even answering questions for him about explosives in the buildings. In fact, Bernard Kerik gave us the first official government pronouncement that no explosives were involved in the destruction of the World Trade Center buildings. And lastly, we have the Pentagon. It's certainly peculiar to say the least that Al-Qaeda terrorists hell-bent on destroying the USA would not crash their plane into the north wing of the Pentagon, where all the most important offices were, like Donald Rumsfeld, John Ashcroft, etc., and that they would instead choose to target the one section of the Pentagon that had most recently been refined. To note that the company which completed the $258 million refurbishment to Wedge 1 of the Pentagon was also hired as a contractor to clean up Ground Zero in New York City. Wedge 1 also coincidentally housed the Pentagon's Budget Analyst Office, where DoD staffers were working on the mystery of the $2.3 trillion that was reported missing by Defense Secretary. The Pentagon's comptroller in charge of that money at the time was an interesting fellow named Dov Zakheim, a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, the International Institute for Strategic Studies, and a contributor to the neocon think tank Project for the New American Century. Zakheim helped write the PNAC document Rebuilding America's Defenses, in which his transformation, even if it brings revolutionary change, is likely to be a long one, absent some catastrophic and catalyzing event, like a new Pearl Harbor. We need to continue the investigation into these people, these companies, and their close proximity to the events of 9/11, and not find ourselves continuously lost inside speculative circumstances. It's time to demand justice and accountability for the victims who were killed on 9/11.
To allow the immigration of German Jews and the transfer of their assets to Palestine. That deal, reported in August 1933, was the transfer agreement. That deal, reported in August 1933, was the transfer agreement. Palestine, sparsely settled by Jews at the time, was radically changed as a result.
I lived in Palestine from 1933 to 1936, and we saw every week transports of German Jews coming to settle in Palestine. And many new professions were introduced by them into the country, and they played a leading role in making Palestine then a more advanced and progressive country.
German Jewish settlement of Palestine was for a time official German Jewish settlement of Palestine was for a time official Nazi policy. The publisher, Hitler's propaganda minister, Joseph Goebbels. A Nazi Visits Palestine was the title of the multi-part series. A medal was struck by Goebbels in commemoration. On one side, the swastika. On the other, the star. One side, the swastika. On the other, the Star of David. Hitler demanded one concession for the transfer agreement, that the call for a boycott of the Reich, raised by Jews here and elsewhere, be rejected by the Zionists. The Zionists made that concession.
That's the Edwin Black book, The Transfer Agreement, a US news report on it, the boycott of Hitler by the Jews.
Well, I mean, this is actually, again, fairly well known to those who know their history, and that he also helped to train Mossad.
Called Netanyahu government fascist.
Well, I mean, we can bandy these words around. They're certainly criminal. They're involved in false flag terrorism, much as our intelligence.
Credit through an international clearinghouse, the German trust fund. The German trust fund would issue the foreign currency of 1,000 British pounds. A capitalist certificate would be given to the German Jew, and that German Jew replicas of his own home. He came across with carpets. He came across with building materials. He came across with cars. He came across with musical instruments. And suddenly, there was a massive German Jewish and infrastructural and economic infusion. It's complex.
Okay, leaving aside the complexity, let me just ask a simple question. Was this then a situation whereby the Jewish community and somehow was contributing to the Nazi efforts and helping to finance what it is that they wanted to be able to do?
Yeah.
What it is that they wanted to be able to do?
Yeah.
And that must have been also one of the causes for such an explosive reaction to your book, right?
Yeah. It's a deal with the devil, not with the angels. It's a deal with the people who want to kill you. So basically, every time they rescued a Jew, they paid into the Nazi economy. And
went on their own, is that right?
They didn't care about the American Jewish Committee.
Right.
In fact, Zionism was controlled out of London. Zionism was controlled out of London until this time. They weren't just taking anyone on a first-come, first-served basis. They were actually concomitantly building the state of Israel. And so consequently, they took the people who had a chance of surviving, in Jewish Palestine, not just anyone.
When we've used this term, the Zionists, that's the Zionist leaders.
You're talking about people like Ben-Gurion. You're talking about a guy by the name of Chaim Arlazarov.
Right.
And Arlazarov was the chief engineer of this agreement, and he was at the location where the Hilton now stands in Tel Aviv, right there. There was no Hilton there at that time, and he was killed presumably by the followers of the dissident Zionist faction, and that dissident Zionist faction, Menachem Begin, but really associated with Jabotinsky.
The revisionists.
And they called themselves revisionists. And the term revisionist at that time meant we have a new idea for Zionism. And these were the fighting Zionists. These were the Zionists who said, we want to fight Hitler out, saying, how can we cut a deal with these Nazis? Because in World War I, to exterminate the Armenians was extermination. So consequently, this was my first book. I was only, I was in my 20s when I started it. It came out in 1984. Confused. There was a town hall meeting set up, and I had 1,100 people. It was rough. There were people who, they said that Muammar Gaddafi was financing me. I had picket lines. They said my parents were from Kuwait. Of course, they're Polish survivors. They hired psychologists to psychoanalyze me. Why am I doing this book? But ultimately, the test of time, the historical veracity, the truth of the book. So it was trial by fire for my first book. It prepared me well for IBM and the Holocaust. By fire for my first book. It prepared me well for IBM and the Holocaust.
So were you surprised as you were doing your research with
covers the minute-by-minute developments in 3 countries, accounting for time zone shifts in Jewish Palestine, in Jewish Palestine, Germany, and the United States. It accomplished what I wanted to do, which is to understand what had happened.
And say you just stood at the Holocaust Museum staring at the IBM machine there and wondering, the computer, why is that there? So
the worst moment was probably when I had a guy, he was an undertaker, and he said to my parents, we want to bury your son's book. The Jewish media at that time, Jewish newspapers in every city, and the Jewish newspapers plastered this all over that the Zionists rescued Jews. Now, there were transfer agreements in other countries. There was the potentiality of rescuing millions of Jews. Millions of Jews could have been rescued. Realists of the time, and by the way, there was no country, there was no major corporation. The main value of the transfer agreement is 1.9, 1.4 to 1.7 to 1.9 billion dollars, the equivalent dollars in today's money that was transferred. What water were they going to use? Where were the roads going to be? Where were the lands? Had the transfer agreement never occurred in the 1930s, there would not have been the infrastructure to rapidly absorb. Remember this, the Nazi program was continued, as you well know, after World War II by the Arabs. They expelled approximately 1 million Jews from Arab lands in the years after the fall of the Third Reich. These people were not put into refugee camps. They were quickly absorbed. The name of the immigration ministry in Israel is called the Ministry of Absorption, and they absorbed these people. And so the answer to Martin Gilbert absorbed these people. And so the answer to Martin Gilbert is that had Israel, the state of Israel, not been aided with this important impetus during the Depression years, it would have been, I think, difficult to absorb. It would have been, I think, difficult to absorb hundreds of thousands of Jews who came en masse during the years to follow. And this was, in fact, anticipated. Well, this is true. There was a transfer agreement in Italy. There was a transfer agreement in Italy. There was a transfer agreement in Czechoslovakia, in Romania. They each had their own financing schemes. And as the situation became more dire for the Jews in Europe, Remember, Hitler went into Czechoslovakia and he went into Austria and he began to take over Europe. Czechoslovakia and he went into Austria and he began to take over Europe. The Zionists rushed frantically to set up more transfer agreements to save the Jews, because you must remember this very important statement, and I will quote you a phrase you know well. So these transfer agreements had the possibility to transfer hundreds of thousands of more Jews. Romania, Hungary, most of the Hungarian Jews were wiped out in transports. They were organized by in transports. They were organized by in Hungary by the one of the members of the board of directors of IBM, Edmund Wiesenmeyer.
Books on ethics, and most recently The Life Worth Living, who was also, you mentioned the scholar who first told you about the transfer agreement, asks, you first heard about the...
I didn't believe it happened in those days because I wasn't smart enough to know that it happened. I wasn't wise enough to know. I'd barely been out of Chicago. I've never believed that the Rockefeller Foundation would have financed a program that sent Mengele of the trial by fire that I had when I did the transfer agreement. Well, I'm constantly asked what-if questions on the transfer agreement. What if the boycott had succeeded? What if the transfer agreement had never been there? But here's one I think I can answer, and it's very dangerous. If is the sketchiest word in history. The transfer agreement, the Jewish agency at the time, I doubt very strongly that there would have been a transfer agreement with the Nazis. Now, it's important for me to explain here. Well, I think that the doors began closing for the Jews very quickly. There were refugees everywhere. We're talking about South Africa. We're talking about Australia. It was very common for Jews in Germany to escape to Austria. And in 1938, they went from Austria to Czechoslovakia, and then the Germans followed them there. France, and then the Germans took over France, and in a bifurcated fashion, and so it was the Jews. An important dichotomy here. Are we going to make an effort? There are many institutions today, such as Mekarot, the water company, which are taken for granted. These are infrastructural companies, and these companies occurred due to the investment that came over the transfer of assets. Now, it's common for some people to say, well, the transfer agreement did not rescue people, it rescued money. That's not true. It rescued people. It's true that the rescue of the individuals was metered out in cadence with the purchase and distribution of Nazi goods. But the fact of the matter is, they had to buy these goods, Nazi goods. But the fact of the matter is, they had to buy these goods in order to rescue the people. Now, what's interesting is, when the Jews were in concentration camps, they didn't say, I'm German. They didn't say, I'm Polish. They said, I'm a Zionist. I wish to live. And the Zionists endorsed that. Jews have a right to live, and they saved the remnant, today. The Iranians trying to do in 12 minutes what Hitler could not do in 12 years, which is wipe out the Jews. And so the Zionists understood that there needs to be operations, the book tried to do what many historians does not seek to do, this together. And this was this was the invention of the Edwin Black approach to Holocaust documentation. Never to look in one place, but 20 places. Why they didn't want to?
Or if it was endorsed by the Zionists.
It's another one of these what-if questions. The boycott has their own economic wherewithal. When they stopped stealing it from their citizens, they stole it from neighboring countries. It was a fascist economy. So it is possibly actually feared.
Subject of the boycott, Joyce Nelson in New York, another reader asked, was the anti-Nazi boycott just a boycott of Jews, or was it bigger than that?
It was way bigger than that.
was never called.
Dov Zakheim is an ordained rabbi and reportedly holds Israeli citizenship. Zakheim attended Jews College in London and became an ordained Orthodox Jewish rabbi in 1973. He was adjunct professor at New York's Jewish Yeshiva University. Zakheim is close to the Zakheim is close to the Israeli lobby. Dov Zakheim is also a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, or CFR, and in 2000 a co-author of the project for the New American Century's position paper titled Rebuilding America's Defenses, advocating the necessity for a Pearl Harbor-like incident to mobilize the country into war with Israel's enemies, mostly Middle Eastern Muslim nations. He was appointed by Bush as Pentagon Comptroller from 4th May 2001 to 10th March 2004. At May 2001 to 10th March 2004. At that time, he was unable to explain the disappearance of $1 trillion. Actually, nearly 3 years earlier, Donald Rumsfeld announced on 10th September 2001 that an audit discovered $2.3 trillion was also missing from the Pentagon books. That story, as mentioned, was buried under 9/11's rubble. The two sums disappeared under Zakheim's watch. Despite these suspicions, on 6th May 2004, Zakheim took a lucrative position in strategy consulting firms in the world. One of its clients then was Blessed Relief, a charity said to be a front for Osama bin Laden. Bose, Allen, and Hamilton then also worked closely with DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, which is the research arm of the Department of Defense, and citizen, and has been tracking the halls of the U.S. government for 25 years, casting defense policy and influence on Presidents Reagan, Clinton, Bush Sr., and Bush Jr. Further intelligence points out that most of Israel's armaments were gotten thanks to him. Squads of U.S. F-16s and F-15s to Israel at a fraction of their value. Dov Zakheim's SPC Corporation provided the flight termination system and command transmitter system. Some people have posited that the planes that flew into the towers were remote controlled. Although sounding like science fiction to the average person, technology has existed for several decades. In an emergency situation in which pilot and co-pilot have been incapacitated, ground control can take control of a plane and fly it safe and sound to its destination. The argument for the use of this technology would be to say that to ensure the planes met their targets, instead of relying on some supposed suicide hijackers who might bail out at the last minute, remote control technology was used. That System Planning Corporation, or SPC, designs, manufactures, and distributes highly sophisticated technology that enables an operator to fly by remote control as many as 8 different airborne vehicles at the same time from one position either on the ground or airborne. System Planning Corporation markets the technology to take over the controls of an airborne vehicle already in flight. For example, the flight termination system technology could hijack hijackers and bring the plane down safely. The flight termination system can be used in conjunction with the CTS technology that can control up to 8 airborne vehicles simultaneously. The possibility of nefarious use of these brilliant technologies developed and deployed by Systems Planning Corporation, partial investigation of what actually took place, pointed out that Rabbi Dov Zakheim was Chief Executive Officer of System Planning Corporation's International Division until President George W. Bush appointed him Undersecretary of Defense and Comptroller of the Pentagon. Not long before Rabbi Zakheim rose to power over the Pentagon's lab entitled Rebuilding America's Defenses, Strategy, Forces, and Resources for a New Century, which was published by the Project for a New American Century in September 2000, exactly a year before 9/11. In this article on page 51, it is stated that, quote, the process is likely to be a long one, absent some catastrophic and catalyzing event, like a new Pearl Harbor, unquote.
Dov Zakheim called for some catastrophic and catalyzing event, like a new Pearl Harbor, being necessary to foster the frame of mind needed for the American public to support a war in the shape of the region. A respected and established voice in the intelligence community, his views were eagerly accepted. 3. SPC, according to their official website, specializes in many areas of defense technology production and manufacture. It allows the control of several drones from a remote location on varying frequencies, and has a range of several hundred. Technology can be used on many different types of aircraft, including large passenger jets. Aircraft as part of the Boeing-Pentagon tanker lease agreement. As the events of September 11, 2001 occurred, little was mentioned about these strange coincidences and the possible motives and proximity of Dov Zakheim and his group, since there was little physical evidence remaining after the gators were only left with photographic and anecdotal evidence. This is a photograph of the flight termination system module from their site. Note it has a cylindrical shape and is consistent with the size and shape of the object observed under the fuselage of Flight 175. In this enlargement of Flight 175, we can clearly see a cylindrical object under the be attached to the right underside of the rear fuselage section. When seen in comparison, it is obvious that the plane approaching the Trade Center has both these structures, the FTS module and the mid-air refueling equipment, as configured on the modified Boeing 767 tankers. Of particular interest is the long tube-like anomalous structure under the rear fuselage area of 175. This structure runs along the right rear bottom of the plane. The equipment attached to the underside of the plane which hit the World Trade Center The equipment attached to the underside of the plane which hit the World Trade Center is identical in every single way to the Boeing 767s issued by Dov Zakheim. Another interesting piece of 9/11 evidence is the last 12 seconds of UA-175. Since every amateur videographer in New York City had their cameras pointed at seconds of UA-175. Since every amateur videographer in New York City had their cameras pointed up at the burning Tower 1, the second plane strike was filmed from nearly every conceivable angle. Expert analysis of this plane leads to some startling revelations. First, there is the expertly controlled flight characteristics of this plane. During its last 20 seconds of flight, UA-175 made a single corrective maneuver so perfectly timed and executed that it could not possibly have been piloted by human hands. If you take a careful look at the flight paths of American Airlines 11 and UA-175, the two flights that took off from Boston's Logan Airport and crashed into the Twin Towers, you'll find a major clue. Not only did both these planes cross paths directly over Stewart Air Force Base, but they did so at the exact same time. Another odd synchronicity is Flight 93, which had been sitting on the tarmac delayed at the airport for nearly 40 minutes with no explanation. At 8:01 a.m., it was delayed until the moment that Flight AA-11 crashed into the North Tower at 8:43 a.m. Another interesting piece of evidence that ties Stewart Air Force Base to the center of this 9/11 conspiracy is the white mystery planes spotted over Washington and the Pentagon. Through careful investigation, we've been able to map out the flight paths of these two ominous aircraft, a type of aircraft that the military uses as mobile command posts. Both of these aircraft took off from and landed at Stewart Air Force Base. Being the comptroller for the Pentagon, you have to kind of wonder what Dov Zakheim was doing on 9/11 and what his connections were to the $2.3 trillion 9/11. And finally, the most important anomaly in the body of evidence for planes used on 9/11 is the passenger list of Flight 77 and the names of some of these people aboard who had top-secret clearances and worked on Pentagon projects, possibly ones that were connected to the technologies that were used on 9/11.
May 2006. My name is Daryl Bradford Smith, and it's great to have you here on another. My guest today that we're going to be talking with, Christopher Bolin.
Yeah, hi. Can you hear me all right?
I sure do, Chris. How are you?
Good, thank you. How are you? That was a company called Huntley USA Corporation, which is formerly known as or ICTS, which is a Mossad company based of Israelis who have had long careers in Israeli military intelligence, and they based their company for international
providing security at airports. They're based out of Amsterdam and Holland. Strange behaviors of these revisit this for a second, because I'd like to use this particular anomaly to bring us into the next one. The two planes that hit the World Trade Center, they converged over Stewart Air Force Base, former Stewart Air Force Base. Now it's Stewart International Airport, and it is the only privately owned airport in the United States, north of the World Trade Center. So this is all within the New York metro area. Is that these two planes, if we use the Operation Northwood scenario, these two planes may have landed at Stewart International Airport, which is in Westchester County, and drones may have taken up their flight paths and continued the flight to the World Trade Center. Of the World Trade Center and the Stewart Air Force Base, some of the same characters? Very good point, very good point. The person behind the privatization of the airport, the Stewart Air Force Base, and the World Trade Center, the architect of the Stewart Air Force Base and the World Trade Center, the architect of all this is Ronald Lauder. He was the director of the Governor's Privatization Board, and he pushed for the privatization of the World Trade Center and of this airfield in the year 2000. And the airfield, the Stewart Air Force in the year 2000. And the airfield, the Stewart Air Force Base, was privatized earlier than the World Trade Center. As you know, the World Trade Center only became actually privately held property on July 26th of 2001. Yeah. And the person that was in charge of the Port Authority of New York, and the person that was in charge of the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey at the time was Louis Eisenberg. He's the former head of the United Jewish Appeal, and he is the person who oversaw the negotiations which delivered the lease, the 99-year lease, into the hands of Larry Silverstein. Well, now it's interesting to note that Mr. Silverstein, prior to his ownership of that building, was a strip bar owner over in Brooklyn of a place called Runway 99. Now, how a man goes from owning strip clubs to being in charge of a billion, I would say that there's a lot more to that story that we need to uncover. But the whole Mena, Arkansas drug smuggling ring, university structure for preparing people to go into the Mossad, isn't there? You would call it, I think you would call it Mossad University. It's in Herzliya, which is where the Mossad has their headquarters, north of Tel Aviv. And it's called the Interdisciplinary. Rich and Ronald Lauder have donated funds to the school, and they have colleges or schools in their name. Ronald Lauder has a school for strategy and government, I think it is. And the Mark Rich has a school for, financial transactions and, director of the Mossad. Relationships that go... You're right, and also Department of State found, I've been researching 9/11 since it happened. And like on this recent story I did about Cleveland, I was just looking at the evidence and the people involved, and there suddenly popped up this key player who was a very, very high Zionist in the United States, a guy named Sam Miller. And he is actually the father of Aaron Miller, who was the senior policy advisor on the Middle East for 4 administrations at the Department of State. And he's the father of Aaron Miller. So, it's a very small network of people. But what I have found at every critical juncture of 9/11, whether it's the investigation, the destruction of the evidence, the mysteries at Cleveland Airport, what have you, I eventually find that the key person who was the gatekeeper or the person who made the key decision is a Zionist with close ties to Israel. Now, this is not a coincidence. Is a Zionist with close ties to Israel. Now, this is not a coincidence. No, it's not a coincidence that some of the facilities were co-leased up in Stewart and co-leased over at Cleveland to government agencies. Am I wrong in saying that? No. To government agencies. Am I wrong in saying that? No, you're right. In Cleveland, these 2 planes landed. One was reported to have been Flight 93, which supposedly crashed in Shanksville. But in this case, the reports are very clear that the passengers were taken off the plane and taken into the NASA facility. And this was when the entire airport had been shut down. And there in the NASA facility, these passengers were interrogated or interviewed by the FBI. Now, this doesn't make any sense. If this plane just had a bomb scare and they landed the plane at Cleveland just to get the people off the plane, why were they taking them there?
Big hangar base.
Yeah, no, what's interesting about that airport, Stewart International Airport, which is owned by a British company that has its base in Texas, in Houston, I believe, that airport was privatized, like I said, in early 2000. But after Britain, Congress voted to give it millions and millions of dollars to build a new air traffic control system, a new control tower, and new hangars. And you have to ask yourself, what kind of privatization was this?
This plane, supposedly, 93, was full of Americans. But from what I understand, if they were deplaned there, or if these passengers existed at all, they had to do something with them. And so basically, either they did actually hit the building, which we have a lot of evidence that says that's questionable, or they had to get rid of these people after the...
Yeah. Well, the thing is that the Cleveland Airport, Cleveland Hopkins Airport, was under the control of the mayor of Cleveland. His name was Michael White. And he's a black man who was under the control. This is all based on the reports from the Cleveland newspapers, because Mayor White, in the year Gray, his closest friend, his best man at 2 of his weddings. When Nate Gray was convicted, then it became clear to the people of Cleveland that Mayor White was probably had headed the most corrupt administration in the history of Cleveland. Now, the thing is that this didn't happen by itself. This man of Samuel Miller, who is the co-chairman of the company Forest City Enterprises, which is a huge real estate company. They, for example, they manage the housing projects where the U.S. Navy people live, like Great Lakes Naval Base, etc. And they own property. Every week, Nate Gray, the man who was convicted of 36 counts of bribery, and the Mayor White, and Sam Miller, they would have dinner at a very fancy hotel in Cleveland. Basically ran the mayor and ran the city. Now this is important because they closed, the Mayor White closed Cleveland Airport. He ordered it evacuated at 10 o'clock in the morning. Yeah. And all of the people were told that they had to leave but not take their cars. So these people had to walk out to the highway to try and get a taxi or get a ride to town to find a place to stay. And this meant that thousands of people were evacuated from the airport. And then at 10:45, thousands of people were evacuated from the airport. And then at 10:45, one plane landed, and shortly later another plane landed. These planes were both identified as having been sabotaged with bombs. The Associated Press reported that one of the planes was Flight 93. And what's interesting in this very short article from the Associated Press, planes was Flight 93. And what's interesting in this very short article from the Associated Press is that the spokesperson for United Airlines confirmed to the Associated Press that this was Flight 93. Indicate that the mayor said that the first plane landed and 200 people were taken off the plane. And 200 people were taken off the plane. And these 200 people were taken into the NASA facility, or in another report they were taken to the FAA facility. But in any case, we have what appear to be 2 planes landing at the airport. One's Flight 93, one's Delta 1989, and the people are floated and interrogated by FBI agents in a NASA facility.
Now, how does that square? I mean, there had to be people who survived these interrogations. Have any come forward? Well, you also made a little visit to Shanksville.
Yes.
And saw that day, and there were some very strange...
At the crash site, the hole in the ground is only about 20 feet across, and it's about 5 or 6 feet deep. And I spoke to a woman who ran up to the smoking hole immediately after the explosion or whatever. It sounded like a tremendous explosion, like an atomic bomb, she even said. And she was working only a few hundred meters away when that happened. But when she ran up to the hole, which she said was about 20 feet across and 5 feet deep, she said there was no evidence of an airplane there. There was no pieces of anything. And this is the fundamental discrepancy. Full of people and passengers and luggage, what have you, disappear into a 20-foot hole and leave no trace of itself behind.
Well, not only that, after the fact, they put armed, the FBI was on the site almost immediately.
They were already waiting for this crash to happen, at that place, it seems. And what they did is they cordoned off the area and put armed guards there and allowed no rescuers to go and sift through the area.
And that's what Wally Miller said. You know, he was the coroner there, and the coroner is supposed to have, in the state of Pennsylvania, the coroner is supposed to have jurisdiction over the crash site or the death. In the state of Pennsylvania, the coroner is supposed to have jurisdiction over the crash site or the death site. And he said that he stopped being a coroner after 10 minutes because there were no bodies there. And you know, this is the thing, is that this is a fundamental discrepancy, that there's no evidence. The FBI then told Wally Miller that, you know, they basically said, are you going to play ball with us or not? The FBI then told Wally Miller that, you know, they basically said, are you going to play ball with us or not? And he had to agree to turn over the site to the FBI. Now, this is important because whatever bodies they supposedly retrieved from this crash site, and this doesn't make any sense, but because this paper did not interview any of these witnesses, and there are scores of them, they apparently did the right thing and came into a lot of money.
And now let's talk about the FBI for a minute here. It seems to be the police authority that is most corrupted in all of these investigations. If you go back to looking into Oklahoma City, if you go back and look at Bill Clinton's MENA, and you look at all of the machinations in Washington, D.C. over the last 20 years,
right.
It seems like the FBI is the one that is the most corrupted. And,
there's no question about it. And I think that they had a cabal of very powerful Zionists running it, going back 30 years or so. I mean, there was Abraham Sofayer back in the Reagan administration time, I think it was, and during Bush father's period, and now we then during the time of 9/11 we had Michael Sherrill, the criminal division of the Department of Justice, and he is a dual national, Israeli American, whose mother was one of the first Mossad agents in the state of Israel. So with those kind of people at the very top, you remember at 9/11 we had a brand new director of the FBI. Brand new director, Mr. And so when I checked into it, you know, and asked, well, who was making these decisions at the Department of Justice, you know, and guiding this investigation of 9/11, I was told it was Michael Chertoff.
Well, and you know, Michael Chertoff's also the gentleman that went up to upstate New York and got a pedophile charge sealed. On Scott Ritter.
Right.
So I mean, you know, when we start looking around at this stuff, it's always the same faces or the people in the same group here.
Right, now, they keep popping up, and they're not, you know, they are not tied to the Vatican. They're not tied to the Opus Dei. They're not tied to the Vatican. They're not tied to the Opus Dei. I mean, all of the people that I have found are neither Jesuits nor Catholics. The people who are in the key position, the Jesuits, they are Zionists, and what we call warm Zionists or warm Jews. That is that they are active supporters of the state of Israel. Like Sam Miller, who I Jews, that is that they are active supporters of the state of Israel. Like Sam Miller, who I told you about, he is the national chairman of the United Jewish Appeal, which is the largest Zionist organization in the United States, collecting money and giving support to the state of Israel. And that Larry Silverstein, the leaseholder of the World Trade Center, was also in a former leadership position. Larry Silverstein, the leaseholder of the World Trade Center, was also in a former leadership position at the United Jewish Appeal, as was Louis Eisenberg, who oversaw the privatization of the World Trade Center, giving it. So what we find is Zionists, Jewish Zionists, at every key juncture of the 9/11 saga. And Michael Chertoff is a good example. I mean, we had, you know, according to Carl Cameron and also articles in American Free Press, Israeli agents who had been involved in either eavesdropping, snooping on these 19 Arabs, or like the 60 movers who were with box cutters and celebrating the collapse of the World Trade Center, videotaping, what have you, like the 5 guys arrested in Jersey City.
Right.
These people were all taken into custody and held, and even, you know, given lie detector tests, which they failed.
Chertoff was also the chief investigator.
Exactly, and that's the key point. Chertoff, I think he was a district attorney or attorney general in the state of New Jersey. Like you said, he managed and oversaw that legal process that resulted in which these Judas goats, these agents, these Zionist agents, and I was very closely involved in both. These were meant to sort of prime the pump for 9/11, so that Americans would get used to the idea that that terrorism is a fact of life and is a danger and a threat to them. So that when 9/11 happened, it didn't come out of the blue. They could say, "Well, look at this is what they finally made good on."
And I happen to know that there are other connections to this particular group and the Pentagon. And of course, I've had, and of course, these same names came up with the Pollard case. The point we're trying to make here is that the organs of control, power, and expression are either FBI, Pentagon, or when you want to look at acquiescing to all these crimes, we can start looking over at the Congress being bought and paid for and having political pressure made by Benign Birth ADL, by Southern Poverty Law, by the People for the American Way. All of these organizations place their blind eye or to participate.
And when you challenge that, like Senator Paul Wellstone from Minnesota, when you stand in the way of that bulldozer of the neocons, like he did, he was killed in a very mysterious plane crash in apparently on their way to that crash site before his plane even crashed. They had driven up from the Twin Cities and they were on the way while his plane was still in the air, as if they anticipated his crash.
Cleveland looks like one of them.
Absolutely.
Minnesota is another big hotspot for child pornography, child sex slavery, as well as political Zionist control. You can take a look at Los Angeles area, you can take a look at Miami area, and the New York region, so that they have a good home base to nest themselves in.
They're in charge of what I call, or some people have called, the concentration camp of the mind, and that is the media.
Yeah.
And in the concentration camp of the mind, and that is the media.
Yeah.
And in New York, it's particularly a tight media. Bush and Cheney.
5-6 weeks ago, 7 now, when Alex Jones came out with this.
But also the way that Amdocs, an Israeli company, handles all the billing for telephone calls in the United States. It's Checkpoint software, and that's out of Redwood City, California, but their main office is in Herzliya, Israel, or Tel Aviv. And it's a Mossad company. You see, what the Mossad does is they have venture cap, and because of their network, they're able to penetrate the U.S. government at the highest level.
Dr. Kunajukr, but I have a delivery going to New London.
We now stand 10 years at the midpoint of
at the address listed under Google, 496 Ocean Ave.
But we can no longer
the
risk the
solar
emergency
panels, and I have
improvisation
been trying to get a hold of him for well over a week.
We have been compelled to create a permanent armaments industry
to arrange this delivery. If you can give them this message, I'd appreciate it. My number is 203-250-2737, and I am here from 8 to 4:30. Thank you. Bye.
By the military-industrial complex. The potential exists and will persist. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic process. Only an alert and knowledgeable citizenry, so that security and liberty may prosper together.
I went through the Pentagon 10 days after 9/11 to tell us where or when we can bomb. Nobody. I went downstairs, I was leaving the Pentagon, and an officer from the Joint Staff called me into his office and said, I want you to know, he said, sir, we're going to attack Iraq. And I said, why? He said, we don't know. He said, I said, well, did they tie Saddam to 9/11? The only tool he has is a hammer, then every problem has to be a nail. And then we attacked Afghanistan and destroyed the governments in 7 countries in 5 years. I said, 7 countries in 5 years. I said, is that a classified memo? He said, yes, sir. I said, well, don't show it to me. He was about to show it to me. He said, because I want to, sir. I said, well, don't show it to me. He was about to show it to me. He said, because I want to talk about it. And I sat on this information for a long time, for about a 1991 meeting I had with Paul Wolfowitz. You know, in 2001, he was Deputy Secretary of Defense, but in 1991, he was the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. It's the number 3 position. He was the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. It's the number 3 position there. I had met him one time. He said, if you ever get to Washington, come look me up. They always always say that. Well, I was there in Washington. It was a Friday afternoon. I visited Colin Powell. He'd given me 5 minutes. Scooter lit Paul. I said, and this is 1991. I said, Mr. Secretary, you must be pretty happy with the performance of the troops in Desert Storm. You must be pretty happy with the performance of the troops in Desert Storm. And he said, in the Middle East, and the Soviets won't stop us. He said, and we've got about 5 or 10 years to clean up those old Soviet client regimes. Syria, Iran, Iraq, before the next great superpower comes on to challenge us. This country was taken over by a group of people with a policy coup. Wolfowitz and Cheney and Rumsfeld, collaborators to destabilize the Middle East, turn it upside down, make it under our control. It went back to those comments. And that's why we're failing in Iraq, because Iran and Syria know about the plan. Why are Americans dying in
future boundaries of the nation of Israel? Many Jews and Gentiles alike are unfamiliar with the future boundaries of the nation of Israel. In the day that the Lord made a covenant with Abraham, saying, unto thy seed have I given this land. Egypt, that being the Nile River on our first map, will reach from the great Nile River of North Africa unto the great river Euphrates in Iraq. Who called the Jewish people when he wrote in Deuteronomy chapter 11 verse 24, whereon the soles of your feet shall tread shall be yours, even from the wilderness and Lebanon, from the great river, the river Euphrates, which runs through Iraq, even unto the uttermost part of the sea shall be your coast. For ye shall pass over thee, shall be your coast. For ye shall pass over Jordan to go into the land and possess it, which the Lord your God hath given you. That's in verse 31. Now the great sea was called the Mediterranean Sea. Now the great sea was called the Mediterranean Sea. But this sea is not called the Great Sea, but the uttermost sea, which means the sea farthest away. That being the Arabian Sea on the far side of Saudi Arabia and Yemen. The Arabian Sea on the far side of Saudi Arabia and Yemen and the United Arab Emirates. This shall be the future border of the nation of Israel that would spark World War III if embarked upon today. Here is a map of upon today. Here is a map of how New Israel will look. The striped portion of land on this map is what eventually will encompass New Israel per Moses' writings. Remember that Abraham was born in Ur of the words Ur of the Chaldees means region of demons. And then he trekked over to the land of Canaan, known as Palestine before 1948, but now called Israel in our time. Then Abraham moseyed on down to Egypt, and king known as Pharaoh, the greatest king in Africa, took Abraham's wife Sarah for the purpose of putting her into his harem, and God himself had to rescue Sarah from Pharaoh. Then, after Sarah died, Abraham and his first son and built that square cube building, which is the same dimensions as the city that Abraham was looking for, that is 4 square. It is called the Kaaba in Mecca, Saudi Arabia, where the nation of Islam and the Islamic people go and have their pilgrimage. Off by Nebuchadnezzar to Iraq and also into Iran. So Iraq and Iran also will be encompassed in New Israel. Now back to our striped map. New Israel will encompass land that will be annexed: Israel proper, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Iran, Syria, and Lebanon shall comprise New Israel. Unto thy seed or children have I given this land. From the first map, and it comes all the way down through Iraq and empties into the Persian Gulf. And then from that border, the prophecy checklist, over 100 Jewish prophecies describing the end time.